Okay, so in this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit more specifically about the research that I did as an undergraduate, wanting to answer some of these questions that I had about cultural imperialism and get at some of these fears that people were having. So I decided to study in a meaningful, in-depth way McDonald's. And that's kind of a funny thing for an anthropologist to study. Typically, when you think of an anthropologist, you might think of us going off to some island or exotic location to study human beings. But we also study modern people and things like McDonald's. So in order to do this, I'm going to ask these three questions. And these three questions will the answers to these questions at least, will elucidate for us whether or not what globalization is and how worried we should be about cultural imperialism. So does the existence of McDonald's within China help to create a homogenous global culture? I should have said I focused quite a bit in particular on McDonald's in China, but as you're going to see, I added a lot more countries later. So does McDonald's constitute a form of cultural imperialism, and does McDonald's contribute to the westernization of Chinese culture? So this is an image of the very first McDonald's that ever opened in China. If you don't know very much about Chinese history, that's fine. You don't need to. I'll tell you a little bit about it because for a long time, because of the Cultural Revolution and communism, China was closed to foreign companies. And so it was a very big deal after 40, 50 years of isolation that China started opening up its economy in the late 80s. So in 1987, the very first McDonald's opens up in Beijing. 40,000 Chinese people were served on the grand opening, and it was this big, huge opening, a rainy day, people waiting out in lines, again, just like we saw at the Taco Bell in South Korea earlier in the previous video. The restaurant contained 700 seats and 29 cash registers, and it attracted this new breed of domestic tourists, and I have that in quotes, I'll do air quotes, domestic tourists, looking for a taste of American life. So at this time, China was still very poor. However, people wanted to go to other countries. People wanted to travel. They wanted to be cosmopolitan world citizens, even though their country wasn't developed and didn't have money. So they might not be able to afford the visas and all of the expenses related to traveling to the United States or traveling to other countries, but they could afford a taste of America by traveling to Beijing and getting to try this sort of staple that they knew is so heavily associated with America and American culture. Where's my mouse? There it is. Sorry, everybody. So, in order to do this research, we wanted to find out who is eating McDonald's and why. A lot of this research comes from this book that I have labeled Golden Arches East. You can pick it up. It's not very expensive anymore. It's older. But they studied women, children, yuppies, which I don't really like that term. I prefer upwardly mobile people, and I'll talk about them, and young students and couples. So let's go through them, see why they're eating McDonald's, for what reasons, and that will help us understand why McDonald's is so popular, why people are waiting hours and hours in the rain in order to eat it. So McDonald's and women, this is the first category. Women, for the first time after the 1980s, 1990s, they were starting to enter the workplace, enter the marketplace, and they were gaining a new status and prestige in their culture, sort of like women did in the United States in the 1950s, 1940s, during World War II. And because they were able to earn their own money for the first time, that's money that isn't associated from their parents giving them money and controlling them. They were able to make their own money. McDonald's became a place for them to be seen. So they would sit in front of the large glass windows and sort of show off, look, I'm a person who is part of this new global economy, this new global culture. I'm a person who can make money myself, go to work myself, I can spend my money however I want to, and I am a part of the new modern economy. There's also an element of gender equality at McDonald's that wasn't available to Chinese women at this time. So if you went into a more traditional or typical Chinese restaurant in the 1980s, if you were alone, if you were just a lone single female without other people, particularly men with you, people would suspect you morally. That would mean that they would suspect you for being a prostitute or a sex worker, something of that kind. But because people watch American media and watch American television movies, they know that lone women who go into into a McDonald's in particular are not sex workers, are not to be morally suspect. So when a Chinese woman walked into a McDonald's in China, people thought, oh, they're just being like Americans. It's fine. Placing your order for yourself is expected, whereas if a woman placed her own order in a traditional Chinese restaurant in China in the 1980s, that would be kind of strange. It was very patriarchal. Men always put in the order. And then there's no alcohol at McDonald's either. That is something that's not true of every McDonald's, but in McDonald's in China, that is true. There's no alcohol, and so it wasn't this situation where if you went out with your coworkers after work, all the men would be drinking and getting drunk, and all the women would have to kind of sit there and not allowed to drink alcohol, because if you drank alcohol in public at that time, people again would suspect your moral character. So going to McDonald's for women was really appealing, and it grew the popularity of McDonald's for women because there was this element of gender equality, and they could show off their ability to earn money. Many of them also got jobs at McDonald's. So children in McDonald's. So children were explicitly targeted, just like they are in the United States, for McDonald's advertising. Not only is there Ronald McDonald, but there is Ronald McDonald in China, but he's actually called Uncle McDonald, and there's also Auntie McDonald. So the McDonald's Corporation sort of becomes part of the family. And in China at this time, and this is starting to change, but they have something called Little Emperor and Little Empress syndrome. I don't really like that terminology, syndrome, but they have this phenomenon, let's call it. So because of the one-child policy, you might have two sets of grandparents here and here that have one child, which become a new set of adults. Obviously, they become a new set of adults, and they have one child, and that is one of these kids in this picture, right? And so this one child is a sort of little emperor or little empress because they control the financial decisions of the entire family. That's two sets of grandparents, that's four people, plus the two regular parents. That would be six people, seven people total. So if you target the child with advertising and you get the child to say, I want to eat McDonald's, you actually earn the business of seven adults. So that's why children were targeted. And parents were sort of okay with this because they thought it was very, very important for their children to learn American culture. They thought American culture was going to be the future for their country. Their country was turning its back on communism and old Chinese thinking, old Chinese ideas, and America is this model of capitalism, which is where China was going. So people needed to learn how to be good capitalists, and they had to learn American culture to be successful in this new open economy. And so parents thought that they could take their children to McDonald's to learn about culture, right? Very cultural place. And this is despite the fact that parents often don't like the taste of McDonald's. They find it, compared to Chinese food, bland. It's just very salty for them. There's not a lot of spices or flavors. They find the food bland. It doesn't include rice, so a lot of people would complain that it doesn't have rice and they wouldn't feel full, even though they might eat a 12,000 calorie Big Mac meal. They would say it didn't have rice in it, so I don't feel full. They would complain, I want something with rice for it to be a real meal. And McDonald's was also relatively expensive. I was in China in 2014 or something like that. I can't remember. And you can get a really delicious bowl of noodles with very healthy with vegetables and meat and all this stuff. It was great for like $1 or $2. But then when you went to McDonald's, it was 3 or 4 times the price to get, a Happy Meal. It was, similar to our prices, like $5, $6 for a meal. So it's expensive, but parents are willing to do this because, and they don't like the taste, but they're willing to do this in order for their kids to learn about American culture. So let's talk about yuppies and McDonald's. Yuppies and McDonald's, I don't like that term. I call them upwardly mobile because for a long time in China, people were sort of stuck in whatever class that they were born into. If you were born a farmer, your parents were farmers, you would be a farmer, and there wasn't really anything you could do about it, and vice versa for all the different classes. But under capitalism, there was a new ability for some Chinese people, not everybody and not equally, to raise their social standing. And so people would get jobs at McDonald's because they thought they could learn capitalist values. They saw this McDonald's as this company that had started small and pulled itself up by its bootstraps and really been successful. So people wanted to work there in order to emulate McDonald's, in order to learn that kind of culture. And so these people were upwardly mobile for the first time. And again, like women, they had a new place in Chinese society as China was changing. They wanted to be seen, to be shown, like, I am a young person who doesn't work on my family farm or work for the government. I work outside in the market and I earn money and I can spend it however I want, like at McDonald's. Now, the fluorescent lights, air conditioning, and modern decor and large windows created this elegant dining experience. How many people here have ever gone to McDonald's because it was an elegant dining experience? I'm going to be asking some of these rhetorical questions. But they found it elegant because fluorescent lights, air conditioning, and large windows were pretty new. They hadn't seen these. Typically, Korean, or I'm sorry, I keep mixing up Korea, but a Chinese banquet hall, a traditional Chinese banquet hall would be sort of dimly lit, no windows, certainly not air conditioning in the 1990s, because again, China was just developing. Despite the fact that most Chinese people did not speak English, McDonald's in China kept an exact copy of the American menu with the retention of English in order to emphasize its foreignness. Chinese McDonald's, they knew that people were coming there in order to learn American culture, so they retained the English menu in order to emphasize we are not Chinese, we are American, right? And they also had these really narrow range of menu prices, still not cheap, but they had a narrow range of menu. So somebody sitting next to you who was eating one dish would be sort of this leveling mechanism. They would be eating something that cost about the same as you. Whereas if you went to a Chinese banquet hall, somebody next to you might be eating lobster and you would be eating sort of fried rice, and it would make you sort of lose face and feel very bad. McDonald's had a sort of a way for everybody to be the same because the menu prices were all about the same. There's my arrow. Now, young couples and young people in general liked McDonald's for a lot of different reasons. They considered it a really good study hall, so they were often open 24 hours a day. And they were air conditioned with bright lights all 24 hours a day. This was really new. There weren't any other places in China right like that at the time. And during off-peak hours, you could go up to the fourth floor. Remember, the McDonald's have 700 seats sometimes. Go up to the fourth floor where there was a study hall laid out with, sort of study chairs, and people would just sit there all day. All you had to do was buy an ice cream cone or a fry, and you could stay there as long as you wanted, as long as nobody needed your seat, and study. And it was a way for younger people to get away from their parents and be really comfortable for the first time to study for exams. They also considered it a romantic environment. Has anybody here ever gone to McDonald's on a date? If you were on Tinder tomorrow and you met somebody and they asked you out and you were really into them and they said, how about we go to this really awesome restaurant? I want to take you out to McDonald's. It's really romantic. How would you react? Interesting. It was considered a romantic environment because of the art, the art on the walls, the fluorescent lights. It was modern. It was different than what was around, and so people went there in order to show off. Look, I know how to go to McDonald's, and I know how to walk up to the cash register, and I know how to place my own order, even though everything's in English, and I know what to do, and I know how to clean up after myself afterward. People aren't used to doing that in China. I know how to pick up my stuff and take it over and throw it in the garbage and then leave, and that's very makes them seem cultured, and they can show off. Like if you might go to a really expensive French or Italian restaurant with a date, and you try to pick out a good wine pairing that matches the meal that you're eating, you could show off in that way. That's sort of how people would go to McDonald's, to show off their cultural worldliness. So McDonald's also leaned into this a bit, and they had this lover's corner. So they had this lover's corner where there are booths with these really high backs that would give some privacy, that would wrap around them, and so people could go there on these dates and they could make out or have a little privacy on their date, and they wouldn't be bothered by other people. Again, would you ever go on a date at McDonald's? I'm not sure.